For nearly 2,000 years, it lay in the ground near Hadrian's wall, a carved piece of wood, smooth from use, ordinary enough, apparently, to be catalogued as a darning tool, a domestic object, a harmless object, something respectable. Then scholars looked again, and the object began to change, not physically. It had always been what it was. But the name changed. The possibility changed. Because this wooden artifact from Vindolanda may not have been a tool for mending cloth at all, it may be one of the earliest surviving Roman sex toys ever found in archaeology. And that raises an uncomfortable problem. How much of history has been hiding in plain sight because no one wanted to say its name? Now, this is not a story about shock for shock's sake. It is a story about evidence, embarrassment, and the strange pressure that modern discomfort can place on ancient objects. Because the past does not always arrive neatly labeled. Sometimes it comes to us as a fragment, a stain, a carved surface worn by hands we will never know. At Vindolanda, on the northern edge of Roman Britain, the world was practical, military, muddy, and human. People wrote letters, repaired shoes, ate meals, made jokes, desired, feared, touched, hid things, lost things. And when one object was placed in a museum category that made everyone comfortable, it revealed something larger than itself. Not only what Romans may have done in private, but what later generations were willing to admit. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because tonight, we begin with a simple wooden object, and the long history of people refusing to look at it directly. Long before Rome, long before written laws, long before anyone could leave behind a scandalous poem or a medical warning, there was stone. In a cave in what is now Germany, archaeologists found a carved object from the deep past, the whole Fels Phallus, roughly 28,000 years old. It is easy, from our distance, to stare at such a thing and feel the temptation of certainty. The shape seems familiar. The implication seems obvious. A modern viewer might want to point at it and say, simply, there it is. But prehistory rarely allows that kind of confidence. The people who shaped it left no explanation beside it. No label, no joke, no prayer, no private diary admitting what it was for. We have only the object itself, its material, its form, the place where it was found, and the uneasy imagination of those who come after. That is where the story becomes more interesting than a simple claim. Because an artifact shaped like a phallus does not automatically mean one thing. It may have had sexual significance. It may have been used in a ritual. It may have represented fertility, strength, continuity, ancestry, or power. It may have carried more than one meaning at once. It may even have passed through different meanings during its life, depending on who held it, who saw it, and when. This is one of the first lessons such objects teach us. The past was not waiting to fit into our categories. We like to divide life into separate rooms. Religion goes here, sex goes there, medicine belongs in another place. Comedy is allowed somewhere else entirely, preferably after the serious people have finished speaking. But ancient and prehistoric worlds were often less tidy. The body could be sacred and practical at the same time. Desire could be folded into fertility, danger, survival, or communal identity. A symbol could be protective without being polite. A carved object could be intimate without being merely private. The whole Phallus artifact sits at the edge of interpretation, where history becomes careful guesswork. And careful is the important word. When people discuss ancient sexuality, there is always a risk of turning the dead into props for modern arguments. Some want to make the past look freer than it was. Others want to make it look more innocent, more restrained, more respectable. Both impulses can distort the evidence. The object does not prove that prehistoric people thought about pleasure the way we do. It does not prove a hidden sexual revolution in the Ice Age. It does not give us access to their emotional lives. But it does prove something quieter and perhaps more profound. It proves that the human body mattered enough to be represented. That form, fertility, sex, or bodily symbolism had a place in the imagination of people living under conditions we can barely picture. These were not crude figures from a crude age. They were made by humans with memory, skill, humor, fear, hunger, loss, and ritual. Their world was not primitive in feeling. It was simply distant from our language. That distance is what makes the artifact so powerful. We are looking at something that may be sexual, but cannot be reduced to sex. Something that may be sacred, but cannot be safely placed in a temple. Something that may have been handled, displayed, hidden, exchanged, laughed over, or treated with seriousness. We do not know, and in that not knowing, there is a warning for the rest of the story. The problem with intimate artifacts is not only that they decay, or that they are rare. It is that interpretation often arrives wearing the clothes of the interpreter. A Victorian scholar might see obscenity and hide it. A modern museum might see sexual autonomy and highlight it. A cautious archaeologist might see ambiguity and refuse the louder claim. Each reading tells us something about the artifact, but also something about the age doing the reading. So when we begin this journey in prehistory, we begin without a verdict. Not because the object is unimportant, but because its importance lies partly in resisting us. The whole Phallus reminds us that before shame had a written vocabulary, before priests, physicians, collectors, and catalogues began sorting the human body into permitted and forbidden meanings, people were already making objects that carried the body into the realm of symbol. Maybe it was touched as an intimate tool. Maybe it stood for fertility or protection. Maybe it belonged to a ritual whose gestures have vanished completely. What remains is a shape, and around that shape, a silence that is not empty. It is crowded with possibilities. By the time we reach the ancient world, the phallus is no longer only an ambiguous shape in stone. It is everywhere, carved above doorways, painted on walls, worn as a charm, carried in processions, turned into jokes, attached to bells, hung around children's necks as protection, drawn with such cheerful bluntness that modern museum visitors sometimes stop in front of it with the embarrassed smile of someone who has suddenly realized the ancient world was not asking for permission to be respectable. But this is where we have to slow down, because the most common mistake is to assume that every phallic object from antiquity must be either sacred or sexual, as though those were separate choices. To many ancient people, they were not. The same image could suggest fertility, masculine force, household luck, divine favor, comic insult, bodily confidence, and defense against evil. It could be funny and serious in the same breath. That mixture is difficult for modern eyes. We are used to classifying objects by purpose. A religious object belongs to religion. A charm belongs to superstition. A toy belongs to pleasure. A weapon belongs to violence. But ancient symbolism often behaved more like a crowded marketplace than a filing cabinet. Meanings bumped into one another. A single object could stand at the crossing of laughter, fear, desire, and ritual. In many ancient cultures, the exposed phallus was not automatically private or obscene. It could be public, even protective. It could confront the evil eye, mock danger, or announce abundance. It could belong to festivals where ordinary rules were loosened, to household practices where protection mattered more than modesty, or to comic traditions where the body was used to puncture pride. That last point matters. The phallus in antiquity was often a weapon against seriousness. It mocked human pretension. It reminded kings, priests, soldiers, husbands, philosophers, and respectable citizens that all human beings lived inside bodies. No one, however polished, escaped appetite, reproduction, vulnerability, or ridiculousness. A phallic joke could be crude, yes, but it could also be socially intelligent. It took the most pompous parts of culture and dragged them back down to flesh. Still, not every object was a joke, and not every symbol was a tool of pleasure. That is why interpretation can become treacherous. Imagine an archaeologist holding a small phallic amulet. Was it erotic? Protective? Religious? Comic? Was it worn by an adult? Given to a child? Placed in a house? Buried with the dead? Sold by a craftsman? Blessed in a ritual? Or purchased because someone found it amusing? The object itself may not answer. Its material might help. Its location might help. Nearby finds might help. But sometimes the neat label remains beyond reach. And this uncertainty does not make the artifact less meaningful. It makes it more honest. The ancient world did not always ask objects to choose one identity. A fertility symbol could be erotic because fertility involved bodies. A protective charm could be comic because laughter was one way to humiliate danger. A ritual object could be physical because religion was not embarrassed by flesh, in the same way later moral systems often became. This is one of the deeper turns in the story. The history of intimate objects is not simply the history of people seeking pleasure in secret. It is also the history of how cultures decide what the body is allowed to mean. In some eras, the body is a divine sign. In others, it becomes a moral problem. In some households, a phallic charm could guard the doorway. In another age, a similar object might be locked in a drawer, hidden under clinical language, or catalogued under some harmless domestic use because the obvious word feels too dangerous. So when we look back at ancient phallic objects, we should resist two opposite errors. The first is prudishness, pretending that sexual meanings are impossible because they make us uncomfortable. The second is overconfidence, treating every suggestive object as proof of private use, as though ancient people had no symbolic imagination beyond the bedroom. The truth, as usual, is less convenient and more human. A carved phallus could be a prayer, a joke, a charm, a boast, a household guardian, a festival prop, a political insult, a reminder of fertility, perhaps in some cases, an object of pleasure. The boundaries shift depending on place, period, and context. And that shifting boundary is exactly why these artifacts keep unsettling us. They refuse to stay where modern culture wants to put them. They are too bodily for polite history, too symbolic for pornography, too comic for solemn religion, and too old to explain themselves. They sit in museums with labels that often have to perform a careful dance. Enough honesty to be useful, enough restraint to be acceptable to families walking past with school children. There is something almost funny about that. The ancient object may have been made to laugh at fear or mock false dignity. 2,000 years later, it is still doing the job. But beneath the humor is a serious lesson. To study these objects is to study a world where sexuality was not always hidden behind the walls we now build around it. Desire, fertility, magic, religion, power, and comedy were not cleanly separated. They were tangled together, and that tangle shaped how people understood luck, danger, health, social order, and the body itself. So before we can ask whether ancient people had sex toys in the modern sense, we have to understand something more basic. They had a far wider vocabulary for the body than many later societies allowed. And somewhere inside that vocabulary, between the charm against evil and the joke carved into a wall, between ritual and private touch, the history of intimate objects begins to take a clearer shape. Not a simple shape, but a recognizably human one. Some evidence survives because it was carved in stone. Some survives because it was buried in mud. And some survives because people laughed. Ancient Greek comedy is not a quiet archive. It does not behave like an official record. It is noisy, rude, theatrical, inventive, and often deeply unfair. It exaggerates bodies. It mocks public figures. It turns private anxieties into public jokes. It says the things respectable speech would rather not say, then says them again, louder, with a chorus behind it. For historians, that makes comedy both dangerous and precious. Dangerous, because jokes distort. They enlarge. They depend on timing, audience expectation, and shared assumptions that can be difficult to recover after more than 2,000 years. Precious, because jokes only work when something is recognizable. A comic reference does not have to be literal in every detail to reveal a culture's vocabulary. If an audience laughed at a mention of an artificial phallus, the object, or at least the idea of the object, had to be intelligible to them. Comedy preserves not only what people did, but what they could imagine, what they could name, and what they knew others would understand. This is where the Greek word often brought into the story appears. Olisbos. It is usually discussed as a term for an artificial phallus. But even here, we should resist treating language as a locked museum case. Ancient words do not always map neatly onto modern categories. A translation may be convenient without being complete. The word may appear in comic, erotic, or satirical settings where tone matters as much as definition. It may tell us that such objects were known, but not exactly how common they were, how they were made, who used them, or how people privately thought about them. Still, the word matters. Not because it gives us a clean inventory of ancient sex toys, but because it lets us hear a sound that polite history often filters out. In Greek comedy, especially in the world associated with playwrights like Aristophanes, the body is never far away. Hunger, lust, flatulence, childbirth, age, impotence, and appetite all enter the public stage. The citizens who gathered to watch these plays were not stepping into a sanitized lecture hall. They were entering a civic space where politics and obscenity could share the same breath. That combination can feel strange to us. We tend to imagine serious public life and sexual joking as opposites. The court, the assembly, the temple, the theater. We want each to behave according to its assigned dignity. But in Athens, comedy could drag the most serious issues of the city through the most physical language available. It used the body to expose hypocrisy. It made grand speeches stumble over ordinary desire. And in doing so, it accidentally became an archive. A proper official inscription might never bother to mention an object used in intimate pleasure. A law code might only name such things if they became a scandal. Philosophers could discuss desire in abstract terms while leaving domestic details unspoken. But comedy had no such discipline. It reached into the marketplace, the bedroom, the kitchen, the street, and the imagination of its audience. That does not mean we should treat every joke as a photograph of daily life. A stage prop is not a census. A body line is not a household survey. Aristophanic comedy, like all comedy, builds worlds slightly larger and stranger than reality. Women on stage may be written through male fantasy. Domestic life may be distorted for political effect. Sexual references may say as much about anxiety as behavior, but the distortions are meaningful. A joke about artificial phalluses suggests that the concept was culturally available. It had a name. It could be spoken, at least under the cover of performance. It could trigger recognition, discomfort, amusement, or all three at once. And that is not a small thing, because one of the recurring patterns in this history is that respectable records often go quiet exactly where comedy becomes loud. The joke slips through where the archive closes its mouth. This is why the Greek evidence feels so revealing. It is not simply that ancient people may have used intimate objects. It is that those objects lived in the unstable zone between private practice and public imagination. They could be embarrassing, useful, ridiculous, desirable, or morally suspect, depending on who was speaking and where. A word on a comic stage does not give us the object in the hand, but it gives us permission to suspect that the object existed beyond metaphor. And it also shows how ancient societies could acknowledge things indirectly. Comedy created a protected space for saying what might be awkward elsewhere. Laughter did the work of evidence. It carried forbidden or impolite knowledge across time by disguising it as entertainment. There is a strange irony in that. The serious historians, the formal documents, the official voices of the city often left us less about intimate life than the writers who were trying to get a laugh. The grand narratives of war, law, empire, and philosophy survive in marble and manuscript, but the small evidence of desire often survives as a punchline, and perhaps that is fitting. Pleasure itself has often been treated as unserious, even when societies have built entire moral systems around controlling it. The comic stage understood what solemn records preferred to avoid. That private desire is never only private. It leaks into politics, marriage, trade, medicine, religion, and law. It becomes a joke because everyone recognizes the tension, even when no one wants to discuss it plainly. So the Greek word matters not as a simple label, but as a crack in the polished surface of antiquity. Through it, we glimpse a culture where the artificial phallus could be named, laughed at, perhaps purchased, perhaps used, certainly imagined. We also glimpse the limits of our own certainty. The surviving language gives us evidence of awareness, not a complete map of practice. That distinction is important, because as the story moves toward Rome, the evidence changes shape again. The phallus becomes more visible than ever, on walls, in amulets, in household objects, in public spaces. But visibility is not the same as clarity. The more often the symbol appears, the harder it can be to know when we are looking at protection, mockery, fertility, or private pleasure. Greek comedy gives us a word. Rome will give us a world crowded with images, and somewhere between the word and the image, between the joke and the object, the private history we are following begins to step closer to the surface. Rome did not hide the phallus. That is the first thing to understand. If anything, Rome made it public in ways that can feel almost impossible to reconcile with later ideas of decency. Phallic images appeared as amulets, charms, graffiti, household decorations, and small objects of protection. They could be worn, displayed, joked about, carved into walls, or placed where people passed by without the solemn hush we now bring into museums. To a modern viewer, this can create a false sense of clarity. The evidence seems so visible that it feels as though Rome must be easy to read. Surely a culture that placed phallic symbols in public left little mystery about its private life. But that is exactly where the problem begins. Public symbols are not the same as private objects. A phallus carved on a wall may be a joke, an insult, a charm, a sexual boast, or a gesture against bad luck. An amulet worn around the neck may have more to do with protection than pleasure. A household image may belong to fertility, fortune, or comic vulgarity rather than intimate use. Roman culture could make the phallus visible while still leaving actual private practices difficult to reconstruct. In other words, Rome gives us abundance and absence at the same time. The abundance is visual. The absence is material. We can see the symbol everywhere, but we rarely find the device. We can trace the public language of phallic power, but not easily the private tools of desire. And that gap matters, because it reminds us that archaeology does not preserve life evenly. It preserves what can survive, what was discarded in the right place, what someone later recognized, and what institutions felt prepared to name. This is why the wooden object from Vindolanda has become so important. Vindolanda was not Rome's marble center. It was a military settlement near Hadrian's wall, a frontier world of mud, cold, letters, boots, barracks, workshops, and ordinary human frustration. It was a place where empire was not an idea in a Senate speech, but a daily arrangement of labor, weather, hierarchy, and waiting. And from that world came a carved wooden phallus, long catalogued as something harmless, a darning tool. The earlier label is almost too perfect. A darning tool belongs to repair. It belongs to fabric, domestic patience, the mending of worn cloth. It is a label that soothes the room. It asks no embarrassing questions. It keeps the object in a category where no one has to imagine the body too closely. But when researchers reconsidered the object, They suggested a more complicated possibility. It may have been used as a sexual implement. It may also have served another function. Perhaps it was symbolic, ritual, or even part of some practice we no longer understand. The point is not that we can now speak with absolute certainty. The point is that the old certainty was itself suspicious. Why was darning tool so easy to accept? Why did that explanation feel safer? This is one of those moments when archaeology turns a mirror toward the present. The object does not only ask, "What did Romans do?" It asks, "What have modern scholars been willing to see?" Because mislabeling is not always a foolish mistake. Sometimes it is a product of the limits of imagination. A researcher looks at an unfamiliar object and reaches for the category that fits the habits of their own world. A museum inherits that label. A catalog repeats it. Visitors pass by. The object becomes stable not because the interpretation is strong, but because no one wants the discomfort of reopening it. Vindolanda disturbs that stability. It forces a reconsideration of what Roman sexuality may have looked like outside elite texts, outside satirical poems, outside moral warnings written by men whose opinions survived because their class preserved them. A wooden object from a frontier settlement is not a polished literary fantasy. It is not an obscene joke painted for effect. It is a physical thing, shaped and handled, surviving only because the conditions of the site allowed organic material to remain. Wood is intimate in a way marble is not. Marble declares itself. Bronze endures. Stone can stand in public for centuries, but wood is ordinary. It warms to the hand. It wears down. It absorbs use. It belongs to daily life, to tools, furniture, boxes, writing tablets, handles, toys, and the small practical objects people rarely expect to become historical evidence. So if the Vindolanda object was indeed used intimately, its importance lies partly in its ordinariness. It would suggest that Roman sexual life was not only performed in literature or symbolized in public art. It also existed in the practical world of objects that could be made, handled, hidden, lost, misunderstood, and finally recovered under the wrong name. And even if the interpretation remains cautious, the question it raises is unavoidable. How many other objects have been softened by labels? How many museum drawers contain artifacts described by function only because their possible intimacy felt too awkward? A ritual object, a decorative piece, a domestic implement. These phrases can be honest when evidence is thin, but they can also become shelters for uncertainty, embarrassment, or institutional caution. This does not mean we should rush through museum collections renaming everything with theatrical confidence. That would be another kind of distortion. The history of sexuality has suffered enough from both prudish denial and eager overstatement. What Vindolanda asks for is something more disciplined. The courage to admit possibility, to say, this may have been sexual, to say, the evidence is suggestive, not complete, to say, the previous label may have reflected modern discomfort as much as ancient reality. That balance is difficult, but it is where the best history often lives. Rome's public phallus was loud, protective, comic, and everywhere. Rome's private secret is harder to hear. It comes to us through rare survivals, damaged materials, ambiguous forms, and the occasional object that escapes decay only to be hidden again under respectable language. The strange thing is that the Roman world itself may not have been nearly as embarrassed by the symbol as the modern archive became by the artifact. The phallus could hang in public as a charm against misfortune, but a possible intimate device in a museum drawer became too delicate to name. That reversal tells us something, not simply about Rome, about us, because every era edits the past according to its own anxieties. Rome displayed the body as power, luck, and comedy. Later scholars sometimes translated that same body into household utility. And between those two gestures, an object at Vindolanda waited for someone to ask whether the safest label was really the truest one. The answer remains careful, but the question has changed the room. There is a quiet cruelty in archaeology. The things that survive are not always the things that mattered most. Stone survives. Metal survives. Fired clay survives. Coins survive, sometimes in absurd numbers, as if ancient people were trying to make sure future historians would never run out of small, round arguments. Inscriptions survive when they are carved deeply enough. Monuments survive when later builders do not decide they would make excellent construction material. But the soft things vanish. Leather stiffens, cracks, and disappears. Fabric rots. Wax melts or collapses. Wood decays unless the earth is unusually kind. Hair, cord, padding, wrappings, handles, coverings, straps. The materials closest to the body are often the first to leave no trace at all. This matters deeply when we talk about intimate objects. Because if people in the ancient world made sexual tools, protective charms, fertility objects, or private devices from organic materials, most of them would not be waiting patiently in museum cases. They would be gone, not hidden, not undiscovered, simply returned to the soil beyond recognition. And that creates a dangerous illusion. We look at the surviving record and think we are seeing the past. But often we are seeing the past after a long, uneven act of erasure. The stone temple remains, the mattress does not. The bronze statue remains, the wooden handle may not. The public inscription remains, the private object made for touch disappears. The result is a history tilted toward the hard, the official, the durable, and the monumental. That tilt can make ancient life seem more public, more masculine, more elite, more ceremonial, and more orderly than it actually was. It can make private experience look marginal simply because private materials were vulnerable. It can make desire appear rare, not because desire was rare, but because desire often left traces in things that time is very good at destroying. This is one reason the Vindolanda object unsettles the story. Wood should not have survived so well. In many places, it would have vanished. At Vindolanda, particular conditions preserved organic materials that normally disappear. Writing tablets, shoes, textiles, and other ordinary fragments of frontier life. These are not grand imperial treasures. They are the kinds of things that bring the Roman world down from marble into mud. That is why a wooden phallus from such a site feels so intimate, even before any interpretation is made. Its survival is already an exception. It carries with it the ghost of countless other objects that may have once existed and then left nothing. Imagine how many things human beings have made for the body, but not for permanence. A carved wooden item kept in a chest. A leather object hidden in a household corner. A wax form shaped for temporary use. A padded implement wrapped in cloth. A small charm tied to a bedpost. A private device repaired, discarded, burned, or buried without ceremony. These possibilities are not proof of specific artifacts, and we should be careful not to turn imagination into evidence. But they help us understand why the absence of finds cannot be treated as proof that such things did not exist. Absence is not neutral. Sometimes absence is cultural silence. Sometimes it is moral censorship. Sometimes it is bad cataloging. And sometimes it is chemistry. The physical world has preferences. It favors what is mineral, fired, sealed, buried in the right conditions, or made valuable enough to be preserved. It is less generous to the ordinary and the embarrassing. A bronze lamp with a phallic decoration may survive because bronze endures. A wooden object used privately may not. A stone carving on a wall may remain visible for centuries. A leather device touched by one person and hidden away could vanish within a few generations. So when people ask, "Where are all the ancient sex toys?" the answer may be partly, they were made from the wrong materials to survive. But there is another layer. Even when such objects did survive, would they have been recognized? An artifact does not enter history the moment it is found. It enters history when someone interprets it, labels it, stores it, publishes it, exhibits it, or chooses not to. Between discovery and public knowledge, there is a corridor of human decision. And in that corridor, embarrassment can be as powerful as evidence. A suggestive object might be called ritual because ritual sounds safer. It might be called medical because medicine sounds respectable. It might be called decorative because decoration asks fewer questions. It might be called a tool because tools belong to a practical world where no one has to blush. Sometimes those labels may be correct. Not every ambiguous object is sexual, and not every phallic form had intimate use. But the repeated preference for respectable categories should make us attentive. It tells us that interpretation is not only about the ancient object, it is also about the modern room in which the object is being discussed. This is the darker idea hidden beneath the material problem. The museum is not a complete memory of human life. It is a survival machine with biases. It preserves the durable over the delicate, the public over the private, the wealthy over the poor, the named over the anonymous, the official over the bodily. It gives us emperors before servants, temples before bedrooms, weapons before textiles, statues before touch. And yet human beings lived mostly among the fragile. They lived in clothing, bedding, baskets, wooden cups, leather shoes, food scraps, smoke, sweat, tools, and gestures. Their lives were not made of marble. Their lives were made of things that wore out. This is especially true of intimacy. Pleasure does not require permanence. Desire does not always commission bronze. Private life often uses what is available: soft, cheap, hidden, replaceable. The very qualities that make an object useful in private may make it almost impossible for archaeology to recover. So the absence becomes eloquent, but not simple. It does not allow us to claim a vast hidden inventory with confidence. That would be too easy. It asks us, instead, to read the record with humility, to understand that the surviving evidence is a sample shaped by decay, chance, scholarly language, and institutional nerve. The history of intimate objects is therefore a history of missing materials. It is the story of things that may have existed in great number, but rarely crossed the threshold into permanence. It is the story of objects that belong to bodies, and so shared the body's fate. warmth, use, vulnerability, disappearance. This is why one preserved wooden object can matter so much, not because it answers every question, because it reminds us how much the archive has already lost before the historian ever enters the room. What survives in museums is not always what mattered most in private life. Sometimes it is only what time failed to destroy, and sometimes that failure is rare enough to feel almost like an accusation. After Rome, the evidence does not simply stop. It changes its voice. The public confidence of ancient phallic imagery gives way to something narrower, more anxious, and harder to read. In medieval Europe, intimate objects do not vanish from human life because people suddenly became less human. Desire did not disappear. Bodies did not become theoretical. But the kinds of records that survive begin to speak through different filters: religious authority, moral instruction, medical suspicion, satire, confession, punishment, and rumor. That is a very different archive. It is one thing to study an object placed in a household or worn as a charm. It is another to study desire through texts written by people trying to regulate it. Medieval evidence often comes to us from institutions concerned with sin, order, health, inheritance, and social discipline. Clerics wrote about moral danger. Physicians wrote about bodily imbalance. Legal records noticed intimacy when it became accusation, scandal, crime, or conflict. Literature could play with sexual humor, but often through coded language, exaggeration, or moral framing. So the silence of the medieval period is not empty. It is supervised. This is where the story becomes especially difficult, because silence can mean several things at once. It may mean that certain objects were rare. It may mean they were common but not worth recording. It may mean they were condemned too strongly to be described plainly. It may mean they were mentioned in language we no longer recognize with certainty. Or it may mean that the physical objects themselves, made from leather, cloth, wood, wax, or other fragile materials, simply did what fragile materials usually do. They disappeared before anyone could put them behind glass. There is a temptation to imagine the Middle Ages as one long curtain of repression, as though every household, every village, and every private life bowed perfectly to official morality. That image is too simple. Medieval society was not one thing. It varied by century, region, class, religion, local custom, and individual behavior. People laughed, cheated, flirted, married, failed, confessed, gossiped, made obscene jokes, and found ways around rules. But the surviving voice of authority was often stern, and stern voices tend to leave paperwork. That paperwork can distort our view. If the record mentions sexual behavior mostly when it is condemned, then sex begins to look like a sequence of violations. If pleasure appears mainly in penitential manuals, sermons, court accusations, or medical warnings, then pleasure itself starts to seem like a problem, to be managed rather than an ordinary part of life. This matters for the history of intimate tools because objects of pleasure, if they existed, would have entered the written record under pressure. They might appear as jokes, as rumors, as accusations against women, monks, widows, servants, or anyone already vulnerable to suspicion. They might surface in coded terms that allowed a writer to gesture toward the thing without naming it directly. They might be folded into broader condemnations of lust, unnatural behavior, vanity, or bodily excess. And when something is recorded mainly through accusation, we have to read with caution. A charge is not always a fact. A moral warning is not a census. A joke is not an inventory. Still, these fragments matter because they show what could be imagined, feared, mocked, or policed. Even when an object is not clearly described, the anxiety around solitary pleasure, bodily autonomy, and uncontrolled desire tells us something about the cultural space such objects would have occupied. They were not merely things, they were threats to systems of interpretation. A private object can be dangerous to authority precisely because it does not need permission. That may be the quiet center of the medieval silence. The issue was not only sexuality in the broad sense. It was control. Who governed the body, who named desire, who interpreted pleasure, who decided whether an act was natural, sinful, medicinal, marital, excessive, or shameful. In such a world, an intimate tool could become more than an object. It could become evidence of disobedience, secrecy, self-knowledge, or refusal. This does not mean we should imagine hidden drawers full of medieval devices without evidence. That would turn silence into fantasy. But it does mean that the absence of open documentation should not be mistaken for the absence of human behavior. The medieval record often forces historians to work by negative space. You look at what authorities warned against. You look at what jokes needed no explanation. You look at what court language avoids saying directly. You look at what medical writers describe with unease. You look at the places where the text becomes suddenly vague, because vagueness itself can be a cultural gesture. Sometimes the most revealing word is the one a writer refuses to use. This is why the medieval period feels different from the ancient world. Earlier phallic objects could be public, protective, comic, and symbolic. Their visibility could be startling. In the medieval record, the body often becomes less visible as an object and more visible as a moral problem. It is discussed through discipline rather than display. The shift is not total. Popular humor did not die. Erotic imagination did not die. Folk practices, bawdy songs, medical recipes, and private habits continued in ways that official culture could never fully erase. But the balance of surviving evidence tilts toward caution, judgment, and concealment. That tilt reshapes the archive. An object that might once have been understood through fertility, laughter, or household magic could now be pulled into a darker vocabulary of sin and suspicion. A physical tool of pleasure might be less likely to be preserved, less likely to be described, and less likely to be labeled honestly if found. It would pass through layers of decay and disapproval before reaching us, and either layer might be enough to erase it. So the medieval silence is not a gap we can simply fill. It is a historical condition we have to understand. It tells us that between antiquity and the early modern period, the story of intimate objects moved deeper into the margins, not necessarily because people stopped making or imagining them, but because the institutions that shaped memory had fewer reasons to preserve them honestly. When such objects or references do appear, they often come disguised as a dirty joke, a moral panic, a legal hint, a medical concern, a word with edges worn down by translation. They survive not in the confident language of public symbolism, but in the nervous language of things half said. And perhaps that is why this period feels so haunting. Not because it is silent, but because it speaks while looking away. The early modern world did not end the silence. It made the silence more theatrical. By the Renaissance and the centuries that followed, Europe was changing its relationship with old texts, bodies, medicine, art, and curiosity. Scholars returned to classical literature. Collectors gathered strange objects. Printers multiplied words that once moved slowly by hand. Satire became sharper. Theater became bolder. Private libraries could hold what public manners denied. And somewhere inside this changing world, the artificial phallus returned more clearly to language, not always as a museum object, not always as a respectable subject, but as a word people knew. The term dildo appears in English literature by the early modern period, including in the world of Thomas Nash and the Shakespearean age. That does not mean everyone spoke of it openly at dinner, or that we can suddenly reconstruct a complete marketplace of devices. But it does show that the object, or at least the idea of the object, had entered popular imagination strongly enough to be played with in writing. That matters more than it may first seem. A word that can be used in satire has already crossed a threshold. It has become recognizable. It can be hinted at, joked about, mocked, sung, or slipped into a line with the confidence that some portion of the audience will understand. Like the Greek comic evidence much earlier, early modern body language preserved what polite culture often refused to place at the center of the page. But the Renaissance adds a different texture. This was an age fascinated by the hidden body. Anatomists opened corpses and redrew human interiors. Physicians debated desire through older theories of humors, heat, imbalance, and reproduction. Artists idealized flesh while moralists warned against it. Classical mythology gave educated people a way to display erotic themes under the cover of learning. A nude figure could become acceptable if it arrived with a Latin name and a proper frame. That double vision shaped the culture of erotic objects. Curiosity was allowed, but often only with an alibi. An object might be collected as antiquity. A poem might be excused as satire. A sexual reference might pass if wrapped in comedy, metaphor, or classical imitation. The learned man could own a suggestive artifact and call it evidence of ancient customs. The writer could describe desire and call it moral instruction. The audience could laugh, while pretending the laughter belonged to someone less respectable. This is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It is more complicated and more human. Societies rarely suppress desire completely. More often, they create approved routes by which desire may appear without admitting what it is. In the early modern world, those routes included theater, joke books, medical discourse, private collections, and the enormous loophole of ancient learning. The body could speak, but it often had to wear a costume. The stage is especially important here. Shakespeare's London was a city of crowded theaters, apprentices, merchants, nobles, plague closures, moral suspicion, and verbal invention. Theater lived in a tense space, public enough to attract authorities, popular enough to resist them, and flexible enough to smuggle all kinds of meanings into wordplay. Body language thrived there because it could operate on two levels at once. A line might sound innocent to one ear and indecent to another. A joke could hide in rhythm, pun, accent, or gesture. This made the theater a perfect machine for preserving unspeakable knowledge, not in the form historians might prefer, not as clean evidence, not as a technical description, but as social recognition. If a playwright or satirist could mention a dildo, even indirectly or mockingly, then the term had cultural life. It belonged to a world where people knew enough to laugh, judge, desire, or pretend not to understand. And pretending not to understand is one of the oldest forms of public respectability. The early modern references also remind us of a recurring imbalance in the record. The people most often writing, publishing, and preserving texts were not necessarily the people most directly represented by the jokes. Women's desire, especially, was frequently filtered through male authorship, male anxiety, and male comedy. When a text mentions an artificial phallus, it may reveal an object, but it may also reveal a fear. Fear of female autonomy, fear of sexual independence, fear that pleasure might escape male control. That fear gives the word a sharper edge. A dildo in satire is not just an item. It can become an insult, a symbol of unruliness, a punchline about absent men, inadequate men, excessive women, or households slipping beyond proper authority. The object becomes funny because it disturbs a social arrangement. It suggests that desire might not obey the structure assigned to it. Here, the history of the object becomes the history of power. Who is allowed to want? Who is allowed to name wanting? Who becomes ridiculous when pleasure does not require them? The early modern world did not answer these questions gently. It often turned them into ridicule, but ridicule can preserve what reverence destroys. A satirical writer trying to shame an object may accidentally prove that the object was imaginable, discussable, and culturally charged. Physical artifacts from this period remain rare, and that rarity should make us cautious. Literature is not a warehouse. A word in a play does not tell us how common an object was, how it was made, how much it cost, or who owned one. It does not let us step directly into a bedroom. But it does tell us that the idea had force. And sometimes an idea is historically powerful precisely because it travels where objects do not survive. Words move differently from things. A wooden object decays. A leather object rots. A private item may be destroyed after use. But a joke can be copied. A poem can be printed. A scandalous term can be repeated by people who would deny being interested in it. Language can carry the outline of an object long after the object itself has disappeared. This is why the Renaissance and early modern period feel like a half-lit corridor in the story. Not fully open, not fully hidden. The artificial phallus appears in literature and satire, but often behind a grin. It may surface in private collections, but under the protection of curiosity. It may be discussed by educated men, but through the safer language of antiquity, medicine, or mockery. It is present enough to be recognized, but not respectable enough to stand calmly in the middle of the room. That tension would follow intimate objects for centuries. They could be known and denied at the same time, sold and mocked, used and condemned, collected and mislabeled, named in literature while avoided in polite conversation. The early modern period did not solve the problem of naming the object. It gave the problem better disguises, and in those disguises, the joke, the pun, the private cabinet, the learned reference, the theatrical aside, we can see a culture negotiating with something it could neither fully admit nor entirely erase. The object had returned to language, but it was still safest when spoken from behind a mask. By the time a physical object survives into the 18th century, the story should feel easier. There are more records now, more collectors, more museums, more printed books, more people writing things down with the confidence of an age that believed classification could tame almost anything. And yet, when the object is intimate, even the 18th century can become strangely foggy. One of the rare later survivals often discussed in this history is a leather erotic artifact associated with the Archaeological Museum in Gdansk. Its exact interpretation, like so many objects in this story, requires care. The important point is not that a single artifact can stand in for an entire century. It cannot. The important point is that something made of leather survived at all. Leather is not marble. It does not announce permanence. It belongs to shoes, straps, gloves, saddles, bindings, cases, and the daily handling of bodies and tools. It can endure under certain conditions, but it can also crack, rot, stiffen, or become unrecognizable. For an erotic object made from such material to reach the modern eye is unusual enough to feel almost accidental. That accident matters, because it gives us a glimpse of a category of objects that probably lived mostly outside formal preservation. These were not royal crowns or legal charters. They were not paintings commissioned for public display. They were objects whose meaning depended on privacy, touch, perhaps humor, perhaps shame, perhaps purchase from someone who did not sign their work. And once such an object enters a museum, a new problem begins. What is it called? That question sounds simple only until you imagine the label. Is it an erotic artifact? A medical object? A curiosity? A domestic item? A joke? A tool? A personal object? That wonderfully vague phrase museums sometimes use when accuracy and comfort begin negotiating across a table. Every label does more than describe. It frames what the visitor is allowed to think. A medical label can make the object respectable. It moves the object from desire into treatment, from pleasure into need. A comic label makes it safer in another way. If it is a joke, no one has to take the desire seriously. A domestic label quiets the matter even further, placing the object among the practical objects of household life. An erotic label may be the most direct, but it also changes the temperature around the display case. Suddenly, the visitor is not just observing history. They are being asked to admit that historical people had bodies much like their own. Museums are not neutral rooms. They are spaces of negotiation. They decide what can be shown to school groups, what can be photographed, what can be named in a catalog, what belongs in an archaeology exhibit, and what is quietly moved into a restricted collection. They balance scholarship, public expectation, institutional reputation, and the discomfort of donors, visitors, and sometimes even staff. That discomfort is not always cowardice. Sometimes it is caution. Museums have to avoid overclaiming. They must not turn every ambiguous object into a sensational headline. But caution can harden into evasion, and evasion can become a second burial. The leather artifact exposes that tension beautifully, because a surviving object is not automatically self-explanatory. It arrives with material evidence but not necessarily with a biography. Who owned it? Who made it? Was it purchased openly, quietly, jokingly? Was it used for pleasure, display, medical experimentation, satire, or some combination we would not expect? Did its owner feel shame, amusement, pride, secrecy, or nothing especially dramatic at all? The artifact does not answer with a voice. It answers with survival. that survival forces us to confront the strange imbalance between physical presence and interpretive uncertainty. A thing can be right in front of us and still not be fully known. In fact, the more intimate the object, the more this may be true. People do not usually leave detailed explanations beside private tools. They do not write, "This is what I used, and this is what it meant to me," then tuck the note helpfully into the future. So museums inherit not just objects, but silences. The 18th century, often imagined as an age of reason, classification, and polite conversation, also had its hidden economies of desire. Erotic prints circulated. Satirical images mocked sexual behavior. Private collectors gathered objects that respectable society might publicly condemn. Medicine, curiosity, pornography, and comedy all overlapped in ways that make modern categories feel too clean. A leather object from this world might sit at the crossing of all those forces. That is what makes it valuable as evidence. Not because it tells one complete story, but because it refuses the convenient fiction that intimate objects were only literary jokes or ancient curiosities. Here is a thing: material, shaped, preserved, awkward. It does not let the discussion remain purely theoretical. And yet, it also refuses to let us be careless. The easiest mistake would be to treat it as proof of everything, to turn one rare survival into a sweeping claim about common practice. That would be bad history, even if it made a more exciting sentence. The better reading is more modest and more unsettling. This object shows that such things could exist, could be made from fragile materials, could pass through private life, and could later force institutions to decide how honestly they were prepared to speak. That decision is part of the artifact's afterlife. In a sense, every intimate object has two histories. The first is its original life, its making, use, concealment, exchange, or abandonment. The second is its modern life, discovery, interpretation, classification, display, embarrassment, debate. Sometimes the second history tells us almost as much as the first. A leather erotic artifact in a museum case does not merely reveal the desires of an earlier period. It reveals our ongoing struggle to decide whether pleasure belongs in public history. We are comfortable displaying weapons that killed people, chains that restrained people, and instruments that punished people. But objects connected to private pleasure often require a longer explanation, a softer voice, a warning sign, or a nervous laugh. That contrast should make us pause. Violence is often treated as serious history. Pleasure is often treated as a problem of tone. But human life contained both, and an honest archive cannot preserve one while pretending the other is unworthy of careful attention. The rare leather artifact reminds us that the history of the body is not a side corridor. It runs through the center of how societies understood morality, gender, medicine, privacy, commerce, and power. By the 18th century, the object could survive. But survival did not guarantee clarity. It still had to pass through the hands of classifiers. It still had to survive the polite instinct to rename it. It still had to find a place in a world where museums could show it, but only after deciding what kind of story the public was allowed to hear. And perhaps that is the strangest part of the case. The object crossed centuries of decay, then reached the modern world, and still had to wait for permission to be named. By the 19th century, the story enters a room that looks more respectable. There are medical instruments now, advertisements, clinics, domestic health manuals, patent language, scientific confidence, a whole vocabulary of nerves, circulation, fatigue, weakness, irritability, and disorder. Desire does not disappear from the record. It is simply dressed in a white coat. This is where one of the most repeated stories about sex toys usually appears. The story that vibrators were invented by doctors to treat women diagnosed with hysteria. It is a famous story because it has everything a modern audience recognizes instantly. Victorian repression, male doctors, female desire disguised as illness, a machine pretending not to know what it was doing. It feels too perfect, and that is exactly why we have to handle it carefully. The history is more contested than the popular version suggests. Hysteria itself was a broad and unstable diagnosis, now discredited, used over many centuries to describe a shifting range of symptoms, anxieties, behaviors, and bodily complaints, especially in women. It could mean almost everything and therefore, at times, almost nothing. Faintness, nervousness, emotional distress, pain, sexual frustration, social disobedience, grief, exhaustion, and conditions no one properly understood could all be pulled into its orbit. A diagnosis that elastic tells us as much about the society using it as about the patient receiving it. That is the first thing to remember. The second is that the tidy claim, doctors routinely used vibrators to bring women to orgasm as a standard treatment for hysteria, has been challenged by historians. The evidence is not as simple, abundant, or direct as the popular tale makes it sound. There were medical uses of massage and vibration. There were devices marketed for health. There were physicians who believed mechanical stimulation could treat nervous complaints, circulation problems, pain, and other ailments. But the neat story of the vibrator's invention as a secret medical orgasm machine is not something we should repeat as unquestioned fact. It became popular because it explains a contradiction in a satisfying way. Victorian culture often presented itself as controlled, moral, and respectable. Yet the period also produced intense interest in the body. Nerves, reproduction, anatomy, electricity, exercise, digestion, weakness, masculinity, femininity, and every possible category of bodily failure. A machine that could sit in the medical world while carrying obvious sexual possibility feels like the perfect symbol of that contradiction. But symbols are not always evidence. What we can say with more confidence is that the 19th century helped transform pleasure into something that could be discussed safely only when renamed as health. The same bodily sensation that might be morally suspicious in one setting could become therapeutic in another. Touch could be improper unless performed by a professional. Stimulation could be indecent unless described as treatment. Desire could be ignored, but nerves could be studied. That shift matters because medical language can protect a subject from shame, but it can also take ownership of it. When female sexuality was folded into diagnoses like hysteria, women's experiences were often interpreted through male medical authority. A woman's distress might be real, but the explanation placed upon it could be shaped by social assumptions about femininity, marriage, obedience, and bodily weakness. Medicine could offer care, but it could also translate dissatisfaction into illness. This is not a simple story of foolish doctors and enlightened moderns. The 19th century was full of genuine medical uncertainty. Physicians were trying to understand pain, mental distress, neurological symptoms, reproductive health, and chronic conditions with limited tools. Many patients sought help because they were suffering. The problem is that the categories available to explain that suffering were often loaded with gendered judgment. Hysteria became one of those categories. It could make a woman's pain visible, but only by placing it under a suspicious name. It could acknowledge that something was wrong, while also implying that the problem belonged to her nerves, her womb, her temperament, or her failure to fit an expected role. It turned complex lives into medical cases, and once desire entered that room, it became easier to disguise. The vibrator, or more broadly, the mechanical massager, did not begin its public life as a sleek object of sexual wellness. It belonged to a world obsessed with curative devices. Electricity itself seemed almost magical. Vibration promised stimulation without effort. Mechanical motion could be sold as progress, cleanliness, efficiency, and modern science. The machine did not have to say pleasure. It could say circulation. It could say nerves. It could say fatigue. Respectability often depends on vocabulary. The object could move through public culture if it used the right words. A device held against the body might be advertised for health, pain relief, beauty, digestion, or vitality. It could enter the home not as an erotic object, but as a tool of self-improvement. This did not mean users were naive. People have always understood more than advertisements officially admit. But the language of medicine created cover. And cover is a recurring character in this history. In antiquity, an object might be called protective or ritual. In a museum, it might be called domestic. In the 19th century, it might be called therapeutic. Each label may contain part of the truth, but each also changes how the object can be seen. The medicalization of pleasure did not simply hide sexuality, it reorganized it. It moved intimate experience into the authority of experts, devices, diagnoses, and cures. It suggested that certain sensations needed explanation, supervision, or correction. It allowed society to speak about the body while pretending not to speak about desire. And for women especially, it often framed pleasure less as autonomy than as symptom, treatment, or problem. That is why the contested vibrator and hysteria story remains useful even when corrected. Not because the popular version is fully reliable, because the popularity of the story reveals what we suspect about the era, that beneath the polished language of health, there were conflicts over bodies, power, and the right to name sensation. The truth is less neat than the legend. There was no single moment when pleasure became medicine, and no single machine that exposes Victorian sexuality all by itself. Instead, there was a gradual entanglement, medical uncertainty, gendered diagnosis, mechanical invention, commercial opportunity, moral restraint, and private curiosity all pressing against one another. The result was a world in which a device could be marketed as respectable precisely because everyone agreed not to say too much. That agreement would not last forever. As machines became cheaper, smaller, louder, and more available, the distance between therapeutic vibration and sexual association became harder to maintain. The label of medicine could protect the object for a while, But labels wear thin when the body understands the object more quickly than polite language does. The 19th century did not invent desire. It invented new ways to diagnose, package, advertise, and excuse it. And once pleasure had learned to pass through the door as treatment, the machine waiting on the other side would begin to hum with a very strange kind of respectability. The machine did not arrive looking scandalous. That was part of its genius. It arrived with wires, handles, polished fittings, instructional booklets, and the solemn confidence of modern health. It belonged to a world that believed technology could discipline the body into improvement. The body was tired? Stimulate it. Circulation was poor? Vibrate it. Digestion was sluggish? Shake it awake. Nerves were weak? Apply the proper mechanical force and let progress do its work. The early mechanical and electric massagers entered public life through this language of cure. They did not need to mention pleasure. In fact, their respectability depended on not mentioning it too clearly. They were presented as devices for ailments, vitality, circulation, pain, fatigue, and the general maintenance of modern bodies under modern strain. The promise was not intimacy. The promise was health. This is where objects such as the VD become so revealing. The VD was marketed not as a forbidden private instrument, but as a curative vibration device. Advertisements and promotional language placed it among the many domestic health technologies that flourished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when electricity and mechanical motion seemed to offer solutions to nearly every complaint. Colds, digestion, flatulence, circulation, and vague states of bodily weakness could all be drawn into the same commercial dream. The machine would restore what life had disturbed. There is something almost eerie about that confidence. A small device could be sold as if the body were a loose mechanism needing adjustment. The human person became a system of blockages, sluggish flows, tired nerves, poor tone, and hidden inefficiencies. The machine promised to enter this system without embarrassment. It was not sensual. It was scientific. It was not indulgence. It was treatment. It was not a toy. It was a device. And the word device did a great deal of work. It allowed the object to sit in a household without announcing the more complicated possibilities of touch. It allowed advertisements to speak in public. It allowed respectable buyers to purchase something that made contact with the body while keeping the conversation safely medical. It allowed desire, curiosity, and self-care to overlap without anyone having to decide which one was truly in charge. The VD and similar massagers belong to a strange moment in consumer history, when domestic machines began to promise a kind of private modernity. The home was filling with technologies that replaced labor, improved hygiene, reorganized time, or claimed to make the body more efficient. A massager could fit into that world. It was another appliance of improvement, another tool for the disciplined household. But intimate objects have a way of exceeding their labels. A machine marketed for circulation does not control every reason someone uses it. An advertisement can name approved ailments, but it cannot supervise private experience. The official purpose may be health, while the actual meaning changes from user to user, room to room, hand to hand. That is not something we can always document clearly. It would be irresponsible to claim we know exactly how every owner used such devices. But the ambiguity is precisely the point. These machines lived in a zone where medicine, commerce, bodily sensation, and polite denial overlapped. They were respectable enough to sell, suggestive enough to become culturally unstable, and vague enough to survive in catalogues longer than a more honest object might have done. This was not the wooden artifact from a Roman frontier, shaped by hand and preserved by accident. This was modern production. The transition is important. For most of this story, intimate objects have appeared as rare survivals, ambiguous symbols, jokes in literature, or fragile artifacts whose original lives are almost unrecoverable. But with mechanical massagers, the object becomes industrial. It has a brand. It has marketing copy. It enters consumer culture. It can be advertised, shipped, purchased, reviewed, stored, repaired, and improved. Pleasure, or the possibility of pleasure, moves into the age of mass production while still wearing the mask of medicine. That mask gave the machine power. A handcrafted erotic object might have to remain hidden. A medical device could be displayed in a catalog. A private tool might be shameful. A therapeutic appliance could be recommended. A sexual object might be condemned. A massager could be sold as progress. The difference was not always the object itself. Sometimes it was the story attached to it. This is one of the central patterns in the long history of intimate things. Society does not only regulate objects by banning or permitting them, it regulates them by controlling their narrative. A phallic charm can be acceptable if it protects against evil. A suggestive artifact can be acceptable if it is archaeological. A vibrator can be acceptable if it treats nerves, circulation, or digestion. The same bodily contact becomes either respectable or improper, depending on the explanation printed beside it. The machine understood that, or at least its sellers did. The promotional language surrounding early massagers often reads like a catalog of anxieties. People feared fatigue, weak nerves, poor digestion, poor circulation, aging, modern stress, and the mysterious decline of vitality. The machine responded with motion. Vibration became a metaphor for life itself. Energy restored, fluids moved, tissues awakened, nerves encouraged back into obedience. There is something deeply modern in that. Earlier cultures often placed bodily power in ritual, fertility, magic, or divine protection. The mechanical age placed it in engineering. The body was no longer only sacred, sinful, comic, or private. It was electrical. It could be tuned. It could be stimulated. It could be corrected by a motor. And yet, beneath the language of correction, the old themes remained. Desire still needed disguise. The body still resisted clean categories. Private experience still slipped beyond public explanation. The early electric massager did not erase shame. It gave shame a plug, a handle, and a warranty. That line may sound absurd, but it captures the strange dignity these machines claimed for themselves. They were noisy. They were often awkward. They looked more like medical tools than objects of pleasure. They belonged to an age that trusted machines perhaps more than it trusted bodies, and for a time that trust made them acceptable. But respectability built on euphemism is fragile. As the 20th century moved forward, the sexual associations of vibrators and similar devices became harder to ignore. The same object that once sat comfortably in the language of home treatment began to shift in public imagination. What had been marketed as health could be reclassified as indecency. What had passed through the front door as medicine would eventually be pushed toward the hidden shelf. The machine did not change all at once. The surrounding story changed, and when the story changed, the object changed with it. That is why this moment is so important. The VD and its relatives stand at the hinge between old ambiguity and modern stigma. They show how an intimate device could become respectable not by denying the body, but by translating bodily sensation into medical need. For a while, the translation worked. The machine hummed in the language of cure, and everyone who wished to remain respectable could pretend that was the only sound it made. Respectability does not vanish in a single moment. It leaks away. At first, the machine is still a health appliance. It belongs to the world of circulation, nerves, vitality, and domestic treatment. It can be advertised with a straight face because the advertisement knows which words to avoid. It speaks of relief, stimulation, vigor, and cure. It promises better living through motion. But over time, the polite language begins to fail. The problem is not that the object suddenly becomes sexual. The problem is that the culture becomes less able or less willing to pretend it is not. What had once been safely framed as medicine starts to gather another meaning. The vibrator, the massager, the curative device, all these terms begin to drift toward a more awkward recognition. And when recognition arrives, respectability retreats. This shift is one of the strangest parts of the story because it shows how quickly an object can change status without changing its basic function. A device that had appeared in health catalogues, pharmacies, or respectable household advertising could later become something hidden, censored, mocked, or pushed into adult commerce. The machine did not need a dramatic redesign. It needed only a change in public interpretation. That is the power of stigma. Stigma does not always destroy an object. Sometimes it changes the doorway through which the object may enter society. It may no longer come through medicine. It may come through secrecy. It may no longer be sold as household improvement. It may be sold as novelty, vice, marital aid, or adult entertainment. The object remains, but its passport is revoked. For early vibrators and massagers, the medical disguise had been useful because it allowed public conversation. Once the sexual association became too obvious, the old language could no longer protect them in the same way. The respectable consumer marketplace began to grow uneasy. Advertisements became more cautious or disappeared from mainstream spaces. Devices that had once promised health became harder to discuss without embarrassment. This was not only a story about machines. It was a story about what modern culture wanted to believe about itself. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were full of contradictions around sexuality. Public morality could be strict, but commercial desire was everywhere. The body was regulated, displayed, improved, measured, and sold back to consumers in new forms. Beauty products, health devices, exercise systems, patent medicines, and domestic appliances all promised control over the self. Yet when a device became too closely linked to pleasure, especially solitary pleasure, the room changed. The same culture that could advertise devices for bodily stimulation became nervous when stimulation sounded less like treatment and more like desire. This is where language becomes almost comic in its evasions. A product might be acceptable as a massager, but not as a vibrator. It might be respectable when used for the back, the scalp, the face, the circulation, the muscles, or the nerves, but not when the implied body part moved too far from polite speech. A personal massager could survive where a more direct label could not. Even today, those euphemisms have not entirely disappeared. The old habit of renaming has a long life. But in the 20th century, the association with sexuality grew stronger, and that association brought consequences. Vibrators and similar devices began to lose their place in respectable health culture. They migrated, gradually and unevenly, into more hidden markets. Some became associated with pornography or adult shops. Some were treated as comic props. Some were pushed into the language of marital difficulty, as though pleasure required a problem to justify it. Others simply disappeared from ordinary conversation, returning to the same old territory of drawers, coded words, and private knowledge. The disappearance from respectability was not complete, and it did not happen everywhere in exactly the same way. There were always overlapping markets and uses. Massage devices continued to exist as legitimate health tools. Medical vibration did not evaporate, but the sexual vibrator, as a publicly recognizable object, began to carry a stigma that separated it from the wholesome promise of the earlier health machine. This separation reveals a deep cultural habit. Societies often accept the body when it suffers more easily than when it enjoys. Pain can be discussed. Fatigue can be treated. Circulation can be improved. Muscles can be relaxed. But pleasure asks a harder question. Who is it for? Who controls it? Who profits from it? Who is allowed to seek it? And whether it needs an excuse? The history of the vibrator exposes that question with unusual clarity. When framed as treatment, the machine could be serious. When framed as pleasure, it became embarrassing. The same motion, the same body, the same private room, but a different moral category. That is not a small distinction. It is the hinge on which the object turns. There is also a gendered dimension that cannot be ignored. Devices associated with female pleasure often attracted special discomfort because they touched old anxieties about autonomy. Pleasure that did not require male performance, male approval, or medical supervision could become culturally threatening. It disturbed not only sexual modesty, but social order. It suggested that pleasure might be self-directed, purchased, controlled, and understood by the user rather than granted by another person or legitimized by an expert. That possibility made the object harder to keep respectable. So the machine was pushed out of the bright language of progress and into the darker language of shame. It became a punchline, a hidden object, a thing one could know about while pretending not to know. In this sense, the 20th century stigma did not create secrecy from nothing. It revived an older pattern in modern form. The object had been public before, but only under the right name. Once the name changed, the curtain came down. This is why the disappearance feels almost like a reversal of the ancient world. In Rome, phallic symbols could be public, protective, even cheerful, while private use remains difficult for us to prove. In the modern period, mechanical devices could be public as medicine, then private as pleasure. Across time, the question is rarely whether bodies existed or whether desire existed. The question is what explanation made them acceptable: a museum label, a ritual category, a medical advertisement, a joke, a warning, a euphemism. Each one opens or closes a door. And when vibrators lost the protection of medicine, The door to respectability narrowed. They did not disappear from human life. They disappeared from the places where polite culture could acknowledge them without discomfort. That is an important distinction. Because the object's retreat into stigma did not mean it became less historically significant. If anything, it became more revealing. It showed that modern society, even with its machines, advertisements, and scientific language, still struggled with the oldest problem in this story: how to name pleasure without losing control of it. The early massager had pretended to be only medicine. Later culture pretended the sexual vibrator had nothing to do with ordinary life. Both pretenses tell the same truth from opposite sides. The object was never just an object. It was a negotiation between health and desire, between public language and private use, between commerce and shame, between what the body knew and what society was prepared to say. And when respectability withdrew, it did not erase the machine. It merely taught it to hide again. The object did not return to public life through a museum. It returned through a shop. That detail matters. A museum can preserve an object. A medical catalog can disguise it. A joke can smuggle it into language. But a shop does something different. A shop places the object in the present tense. It says, "This is not only a historical curiosity, not only a diagnosis, not only a punchline from someone else's embarrassment. This is something a living person may ask about, choose, compare, purchase, and use." By the 1970s, that change had become part of a wider cultural shift. The sexual revolution, feminist health movements, and growing conversations around bodily autonomy were changing the language available to women. Not everywhere, not evenly, not without backlash, but enough that some people began to challenge the old arrangement in which sexual knowledge was filtered through doctors, husbands, moral authorities, advertisers, or jokes written at women's expense. Into that moment came women-centered and sex-positive stores that treated sexual objects not as shameful novelties, but as tools of education, self-knowledge, and pleasure. One of the most important examples was Good Vibrations, founded by Joanny Blank in San Francisco in 1977. The name itself feels like a small act of reclassification. Good Vibrations did not approach the vibrator as a dirty secret accidentally left in the wrong drawer. It treated the object as something that could be discussed openly, intelligently, and without humiliation. This was not merely a retail decision. It was a philosophical one. Because to sell such objects in a feminist educational context was to challenge several older stories at once. It challenged the medical story, which had framed women's bodies as problems to be treated. It challenged the pornographic or novelty story, which often framed sex toys through male fantasy, embarrassment, or cheap spectacle. It challenged the moral story, which treated pleasure as suspicious unless justified by marriage, reproduction, illness, or secrecy. And it challenged the comic story, which allowed the object to be named only if someone was laughing at it. In a place like Good Vibrations, the object could be discussed without disguise. That sounds simple. It was not. Naming pleasure directly has always been one of the most difficult acts in this history. Not because people lacked desire, but because public language around desire was repeatedly controlled by institutions that had reasons to mistrust it. Religion could define it as sin. Medicine could define it as illness. Commerce could exploit it while keeping it tawdry. Law could regulate it. Comedy could mock it. The feminist sex-positive store offered another possibility: education. That shift changed the emotional atmosphere around the object. A vibrator did not need to pretend to be medicine. It did not need to hide as a personal massager, though euphemisms would certainly continue. It could be described in relation to anatomy, consent, communication, pleasure, and self-understanding. The customer did not have to enter as a patient, deviant, or punchline. She could enter as a person seeking information. This is one of those historical changes that is easy to underestimate because it happened at the level of tone. Tone is not trivial. A room can shame you before anyone says a word. A store can make a person feel exposed, judged, foolish, or unsafe. But a different kind of room can do the opposite. It can make questions possible. It can turn secrecy into conversation. It can replace the nervous laugh with practical speech. That was part of the revolution. The objects themselves mattered, of course, but the surrounding language mattered just as much. The vibrator's meaning changed because the story around it changed. Once again, the object was not only an object. It was a negotiation between body and culture. The difference in the 1970s was that some women insisted on joining that negotiation as authorities over their own experiences. This was not a perfect or universal movement. Early sex-positive feminism had its debates, exclusions, disagreements, and blind spots. Not every feminist agreed on pornography, sex commerce, pleasure, or the politics of desire. Not every woman felt represented by the same language of liberation. Race, class, sexuality, disability, religion, and culture shaped who could access these spaces and who felt safe inside them. But even with those complications, the shift was real. Sex toys were being reframed not as evidence of failure, loneliness, excess, or medical disorder, but as part of sexual knowledge. That was a profound reversal. For centuries, intimate objects had often been interpreted by others: the scholar, the priest, the physician, the satirist, the cataloguer, the museum curator, the advertiser. Now the user's perspective began to move closer to the center. That may be the most important change. The question became less, what category can society place this object in? And more, what does this object allow a person to understand about their own body? That is a different kind of history. Less monumental, perhaps, but deeply consequential. The old anxieties did not disappear. They rarely do. Sex toys still carried stigma. Laws still restricted sales in many places. Public conversation could still be hostile, mocking, or embarrassed. Even the language of sexual wellness, which would later become more mainstream, had not yet fully softened the subject for polite commerce. These stores operated against a current of suspicion, but their existence proved that the object could be given a new public life, not as a disguised machine, not as a forbidden joke, not as a museum oddity with a careful label, as a tool. A tool not in the evasive sense of the old darning tool, but in a direct and human sense, something made for use, learning, confidence, pleasure, and choice. That reversal is almost elegant. At the beginning of this story, we saw an object possibly mislabeled because its intimate meaning was too uncomfortable to name. In the feminist shops of the 1970s, naming became part of the point. The object no longer had to survive under a false identity. It could stand in the open, not because society had become entirely free of shame, but because some people had built rooms where shame was not allowed to set the rules, and the effect reached beyond the object itself. These shops helped change how people talked about anatomy, about consent, about masturbation, about relationships, about what women were taught to expect from sex and what they were taught to ignore. They offered books, workshops, conversations, and a different kind of customer service. One that treated knowledge as protection rather than corruption. In that sense, they were not simply selling products. They were repairing language. A culture cannot understand what it cannot name. It cannot ask for what it has only been taught to joke about. It cannot challenge bad information if embarrassment keeps everyone quiet. The return of the unspoken, then, was not just about visibility. It was about vocabulary. The vibrator entered a new chapter of its public life because the words around it changed from cure, vice, and novelty to education, autonomy, and pleasure. Of course, mainstream culture would later absorb some of this language in cleaner, more commercial forms. The edges would be softened. Packaging would become elegant. Brands would speak in calm colors and abstract shapes. But before the modern wellness aesthetic, there were spaces that had to do the harder work, making the conversation possible at all. That is why the 1970s matter in this long history. They mark a moment when the object began to emerge from behind the masks it had worn for centuries. Not everywhere, not completely, but clearly enough that the old question had to be asked in a new way. Not, what excuse makes this object acceptable, but who has the right to decide what it means? And for the first time in a very long time, the answer did not belong only to doctors, moralists, satirists, or museum labels. It began to belong to the people who used it. The modern object is quieter than its ancestors. It does not need a comic mask, a medical excuse, or a museum apology. At least not always. It may appear in a clean box, in soft colors, with language borrowed from wellness, design, psychology, and self-care. It may be sold online beside skincare, sleep aids, supplements, and devices meant to improve breathing, posture, or mood. The old machinery of shame has not disappeared, but it has learned to speak more softly. This is the era of sexual wellness. That phrase would have sounded strange in many earlier parts of this story. For much of history, an intimate object had to survive by being something else. A charm, a ritual symbol, a joke, a medical instrument, a novelty, a private embarrassment, or an artifact with a cautious label. Now the object can often be presented as part of health, but in a different sense from the 19th century. Not as a cure for hysteria, not as treatment for vague nervous complaints, rather as one part of a broader conversation about bodies, pleasure, stress, identity, confidence, and personal choice. The language has changed, and language, in this history, is never a small thing. Modern sexual wellness brands often avoid the crude theatricality that once surrounded adult products. The packaging may be minimalist. The device may look less like a forbidden object than a piece of consumer electronics. Smooth surfaces, rechargeable batteries, app-controlled settings. abstract shapes that avoid obvious resemblance, a design vocabulary that says, in effect, this belongs in the open, or at least it does not have to hide quite so desperately. That aesthetic is more than marketing. It is a form of cultural negotiation. The modern object is trying to escape the older categories that trapped its predecessors. It does not want to be a dirty joke. It does not want to be a medical lie. It does not want to be hidden under language so vague that no one can ask a clear question. It wants to be ordinary enough to purchase, discuss, review, gift, compare, and improve. But ordinariness has its own complications. When an object becomes mainstream, it can gain respectability while losing some of its political edge. The language of autonomy can become branding. The language of wellness can smooth away harder questions about access, consent, gender, disability, education, and inequality. A device may be beautifully designed and still exist in a world where many people are denied honest sexual information. A product may appear liberated while the culture around it remains uneven, judgmental, or commercially exploitative. So the modern story is not simply one of progress. It is a story of translation. The same object that once needed to be called medicine may now be called wellness. The same discomfort that once produced silence may now produce tasteful abstraction. Instead of hiding the object in a locked drawer, modern culture may hide the awkwardness inside elegant branding. The shame is reduced, perhaps, but not always gone. Sometimes it has just become better lit. Still, something has genuinely shifted. People can speak more openly now than many earlier societies allowed. Not everywhere, not safely for everyone, and not without backlash. But the public vocabulary has expanded. Sexual objects are increasingly discussed in relation to pleasure, anatomy, intimacy, communication, and self-knowledge. They appear in mainstream retail, in educational content, in therapy conversations, and in the broader market of body-focused technology. That visibility would have been difficult to imagine in the age of the VD's medical disguise, and almost absurd beside the museum label that turned a possible Roman intimate object into a darning tool. Yet the ancient shadow remains, because even the most modern device carries the old questions with it. Who gets to name the object? Who gets to decide whether it is respectable? Who is allowed to want without apology? Who profits from desire? Who is protected by the new openness, and who is still judged by it? The form has changed, but the argument is ancient. The phallic charm, the comic Greek reference, the Roman artifact, the medieval silence, the early modern joke, the leather survival, the medical massager, the feminist shop, the wellness brand. All of them belong to the same long struggle over the meaning of the body. That is why this history should not be treated as a parade of strange objects. The objects are interesting, of course. Some are odd, some are beautiful, some are awkward, some are funny in ways their makers may or may not have intended. But the deeper story is not about novelty. It is about negotiation. Every era made choices about desire. Some wrapped it in ritual. Some mocked it. Some feared it. Some diagnosed it. Some sold it in secret. Some taught people to speak about it more honestly. And some, like our own, tried to make it sleek, safe, branded, and calm enough to place beside other forms of self-care. That does not make the modern era uniquely enlightened. It makes it another chapter in the same human pattern. We are still deciding what the body is allowed to mean. The difference is that today, the object may no longer have to pretend so completely. It may not need to be a darning tool, a curative appliance, or a shameful novelty. It can be designed with intention. It can be reviewed as technology. It can be discussed as part of intimacy rather than evidence of failure. It can be marketed to couples, individuals, women, men, queer communities, disabled users, and people whose experiences earlier records often ignored completely. In that expansion, there is real historical weight, because to bring an intimate object into ordinary language is to challenge the older belief that pleasure must either be hidden, excused, or controlled by someone else. It does not solve every problem, but it changes the starting point. And perhaps that is why the modern object feels both new and ancient. Its materials are modern: silicone, motors, batteries, algorithms, packaging, logistics, customer reviews, discreet shipping. But the questions around it are as old as carved stone. What is sacred? What is shameful? What is funny? What is dangerous? What is healing? What is private? What belongs in public memory? The ancient world left us symbols. The modern world leaves us products. Both can mislead. A symbol can seem clearer than it is. A product can seem freer than it is. But each one reveals something about the society that made room for it, or refused to. So when we look at a modern sexual wellness device, we are not looking only at technology. We are looking at the descendant of a long, uneasy lineage. Objects shaped by hands, hidden by shame, renamed by scholars, defended by doctors, sold by feminists, polished by designers, and still surrounded by arguments over the body. The modern object may sit under soft lighting, but its shadow stretches back thousands of years. And so we return, quietly, to the object in the case. Not one object only, but many. Carved, broken, softened by labels, protected by uncertainty, or hidden under words that make them easier to display. A phallus becomes a charm. A possible intimate tool becomes a domestic implement. A machine becomes medicine. A product becomes wellness. Again and again, the body survives by borrowing another name. That is the central mystery of this history. Not whether human beings desired. That answer is not mysterious at all. The mystery is how often desire had to be translated before it could enter memory. Museums face a difficult task here. They cannot simply announce certainty where evidence is incomplete. Many artifacts remain ambiguous for good reasons. A shape may suggest one use but not prove it. A text may preserve a joke, but not a daily habit. A device may be marketed for health and used for something more private. Responsible history has to leave room for doubt, but doubt can become a hiding place. When every uncomfortable object is called ritual, medical, decorative, domestic, or symbolic, the past begins to look cleaner than it was. Not more accurate. Cleaner. And cleanliness is not the same as truth. The most honest labels may be the ones that admit tension. This object may have been protective, erotic, comic, ritual, or practical. Its meaning is uncertain. Its previous classification may reflect modern discomfort. Its survival is rare. Its interpretation remains open. That kind of label does not weaken history. It respects it. Because the past was not made of perfect categories. It was made of people, people who prayed, joked, feared, touched, desired, concealed, exaggerated, misunderstood, and left behind objects that now sit beneath museum lights, separated from the hands that once gave them meaning. From the carved stone of deep prehistory to the wooden artifact at Vindolanda, from Greek comic language to Roman amulets, from medieval evasions to Renaissance satire, from leather survivals to humming machines sold as medicine, the pattern is clear. These objects were never simply strange toys. They were evidence of the way societies negotiated the body. Some eras made the phallus public, but left private use obscure. Some condemned pleasure, yet preserved it through jokes and warnings. Some medicalized desire so thoroughly that a machine could enter the home as treatment. Some later reclaimed the object as education, autonomy, and ordinary human knowledge. None of these stages gives us the whole truth. Each gives us a fragment. And fragments are all we usually get when the subject is private life. History is often imagined as a grand record of kings, wars, borders, inventions, and laws. But much of human existence happened outside those official frames. It happened in rooms without witnesses, in gestures no archive recorded, in objects made from fragile materials, in jokes too rude for formal histories, in labels written by people who may not have known what they were holding. That is why the unresolved objects matter. They remind us that memory is not only about what survives, it is also about what later societies permit survival to mean. A museum can preserve an artifact and still soften its truth. A catalog can protect an object and still misname it. A culture can display the past while quietly editing out the parts that make visitors shift their weight and look away. The final answer, then, is not that every disputed object was sexual. That would be careless. The answer is more careful and more unsettling. Many of history's most private objects survive only in fragments, and some were hidden twice. First by the lives that kept them private, and then by the institutions that struggled to name them. What they reveal is not only how people sought pleasure, they reveal who was allowed to speak about pleasure, who was denied that language, who turned it into sin, cure, joke, product, or proof, and who, centuries later, still hesitates before writing the label. So the next time an object in a museum seems strangely vague, strangely polite, or strangely over-explained, it may be worth pausing. Not to force a scandal onto it, but to ask what kind of silence surrounds it. Because sometimes the most revealing thing in the display case is not the artifact itself, it is the name we chose instead.